Okay.
Thanks much. Good morning, everybody. We'll be informal, but Dr. Duran-Jimenez and I have a few prepared remarks that we want to make about equity in the classroom. And so I was trying to come up with a clever title for this presentation, but this is the best I could do because I've been down with COVID for the last 2 weeks, and the creativity juices just aren't quite flowing as good as usual. Apples and equitables. And it comes from the idea of the difference between equality and equity, and that some folks have a trouble figuring out what the similarities and differences are between equity and equality. So, my name is Dr. Michael Chaness. I teach in Anthropology and Native American Studies, and my partner for this tag team will be Dr. Celinet Duran-Jimenez, who teaches in the Department of Criminal Justice. The subtitle of our discussion today will be "What is Equity and How it Can Be Applied in the Classroom?" So Celinet, will you will you click one? I feel like now I feel like when I was a teaching assistant. So, like I said, sometimes, even in the best of circumstances, equity gets confused with equality. Our definition, or our working definition this morning of equity, is that equity, like trust, must be cultivated in the classroom from day one. Equity is not synonymous with equality. And I'm not putting up the picture of the kids trying to watch the baseball game. If you haven't seen the picture of the cartoon of the kids trying to watch the baseball game, that's another way folks have this conversation. But equity for us is not synonymous with equality. Equity is proactive, ever evolving, and anchored by justice. Now, this is just a simple definition. So I think that before we really get going, or as a prelude to getting going, I want to talk about, for me, and Celinet will as well, inside the classroom, what equity looks like. So, Dr. Duran, maybe you'll do your part of you'll do your spiel on bullet one, and on let's just take them one at a time. Why don't I'll talk first on bullet one, and then you talk about your ideas on bullet one.
Sounds
So
good.
my courses have very low cost. My NAS 100 course, which is my largest course, the 100-person course, if you get the books used, it's under $20. It can be $15. They're just two primary textbooks, and they have a very low cost, and they're very readily available. If you get the ebook, it's cheaper, and then students, I tell them not to do this, but they rent the ebook, and it can be even cheaper for these texts. My most expensive class is $50, which means that I don't use any, primary textbooks, because textbooks are expensive. The only reason that my most expensive class is $50 is because it's literally titled Contemporary Native America. So we are reading contemporary books written in the last 5 years. And those books tend to be the most expensive. Sometimes they're only available in hardcover. But I try and keep the cost of my courses as low as possible. So that means in all my classes, we read full books that are just only slightly supplemented with PDFs or other articles that I can provide to students for free. I thought that I was being very conscious of that I was being very that I was doing a good job. And I still think I'm doing a good job, but it's always wonderful to meet colleagues who are doing a great job. And I think that Dr. Duran is doing a great job in this respect. So, Celinet, where are your costs at for your courses?
$0.00. So the entire time that I've taught here for SUNY Oswego, including the year that I was adjuncting online, my 2 years of my Prodigy Fellowship, and now my second year in the 10-year track, none of my classes require any additional costs outside of what students pay in tuition or if they are in room and board, and that is for several reasons. So for the first, as Dr. Hannes already mentioned, traditional college textbooks are extremely expensive, especially in criminal justice. The average textbook for an intro course can run anywhere from $90 to $120. And as a first generation student who put herself through college and had to pay for books, all I remember was being an undergrad and having to pay for tuition and then the additional sticker price of what I was spending in books. So when I was an undergrad, I was kind of like a double, triple major. So in any given semester, I was spending somewhere between $500 to $600 in books, which I recognize I was also very privileged in being able to do that because I lived at home. Whatever I couldn't afford, my parents did supplement. I also did have access to a lot of scholarships and fellowships that supplied books, but not all students have that. So as an instructor, I make it a point for students to not have to pay for any additional materials whatsoever, especially because I understand that in the hard sciences and other subjects, students cannot get away from that just because of the nature of the material. So I don't want to add on to that. Secondly, criminal justice textbooks are horrifically underrepresented. They tend to perpetuate a lot of stereotypes. So studies have shown that I've relied on a lot of studies pedagogically that address how even images in criminal justice textbooks perpetuate this aspect of underrepresented minorities being portrayed as criminals or offenders in their texts, while white males are most likely to be portrayed as police officers. And I just don't want to continue perpetuating that imagery in my class. So this gives me an opportunity to curate materials that are more contemporaneous. So not only am I able to provide more representation in the text that I choose, I make it a point to highlight women, to highlight POCs, to highlight LGBTQ voices in the classroom with the readings that I provide. But I'm also able to update the materials in real time. So for example, last semester, I gave them a reading from Kristen Henning's book on how we criminalize Black and Brown youth. And one of the chapters that I assigned was on how we criminalize dress. Because of this law that was passed in Philadelphia as of December 2023, where it is now illegal to wear ski masks, we were able to have a conversation that contextualized that text, that looked at how we criminalize dress for certain populations and what types of implications that this new law in Philadelphia will hold. So it gives me an opportunity to not only make it zero cost and accessible for students, it also helps students see how the issues that we discuss in class are extremely timely and relevant to other aspects that we will be reviewing in the course.
Yeah, I admire that you have that kind of fluidity built into the pedagogy itself. I remember in graduate school, some of the most memorable classes for me was when the teacher would just come in with the newspaper. And like that is really what we talked about that day as we went over what was in the newspaper, not as journalists, but as scholars of religion, that you could see it embedded um, throughout our contemporary world. And yeah, with having that kind of a model, it begs you to swap. It begs you to be current. It demands it of you. Also, thanks for bringing up that point about the fact that this is not possible for all disciplines. Like, not all disciplines could conceive of a course or have a zero cost course. So it makes it even more significant for those of us that have that ability or who could conceive of an entire class as a low cost course or as a zero cost course, which you have. Um, to do that because we know that that's not happening for our students across all the disciplines, and we know that wouldn't even be possible across all the disciplines here at our university. I just briefly want to talk about digital accessibility before we move on to cultural preparedness. And digital accessibility was one of my epiphanies during COVID, was that I had many PDFs. Like I said, I'm trained as a historian of religion, and there might not be any discipline, maybe philosophy, who is more attached to their PDFs than historians of religion, and that none of them were accessible. that I had been using material for years that wasn't accessible to the entire student population. So as I was learning how to do Zoom and I was learning how to do Panopto and I was learning how to create digitally accessible content, I had to then go back to that content that I was unwilling to let go of and reform it in order to be accessible. I was really happy that once I came to this realization, it was folks like, John Kane and Rebecca Mushtare and um, a whole host of folks Casey, who are working in as the accessibility team here, really the accessibility workshop team here, who had been doing this for years, had been thinking about it for years, and who had been supporting each other for years, creating digitally accessible content, as well as going back and fixing. And Kate is really great here, going back and fixing non-accessible content. So when we are creating courses, whether that is in person or asynchronously online, and I teach asynchronous courses every winter and summer still, when we're creating these courses, being conscious of digital accessibility is a huge part of equity. You have to make sure that the content that you're not only the content that you're creating, but the content that you're assigning is available to each and every student. Like that's the proactive, that's the ever evolving, that's the anchored by justice. Just like Dr. Duran was saying, how she changes the syllabus, she changes the assignments based on what is going on politically, economically, culturally, to reflect her discipline of criminal justice. Um, we have to be conscious of our ever changing and our ever evolving responsibilities. Yeah, I had seen those red markers on it was Blackboard and Moodle and Canvas. I had seen those for years, but I had never really kind of considered what it meant or really looked at it through the eyes of a student who was relying on digitally accessible content to know that there was content that was assigned to them that they couldn't comprehend, that they couldn't absorb, that they couldn't see, that they couldn't hear. I would never want to be in that position. So I took it upon myself to revamp my classes um, using principles of universal design for learning, or UDL. And I also served as the one of the accessibility fellows at SUNY Oswego in order to learn about all layers and all levels of digital accessibility. Again, maybe that might not mean much for folks teaching who only teach in person, but I'm going to continue to teach online classes and I'm going to continue to change those online classes. So digital accessibility and principles of UDL, that's just the way forward. If you're going to create content and if you're going to assign content and make sure that it's available to each and every student in your class. Dr. Duran, maybe you could talk about cultural preparedness.
Yeah, so when I try, so again, I'm very mindful of the fact that I'm able to do this in my discipline. This isn't necessarily something that works across the board, but that is one of the reasons why I chose the field that I'm in is one, the interdisciplinary aspect of a criminal justice curriculum, where you can pull in and should be pulling in aspects from sociology, philosophy, literature, political science, politics, anything that makes it relevant to students. Now, when I first started teaching, I was not aware to what extent my very traditional criminal justice training I was producing that in the classroom because the people who trained me did not look like me, did not have the same experiences as I did. And I was reflecting a lot of that in my pedagogy, in the ways that I would approach teaching. But I was very grateful for the fact that students are very comfortable talking to me and giving me honest feedback on what they would like to see more of. So for example, in my criminology course, which tends to be weighed very heavily on very traditional historical criminologists. My students want to see more cultural examples of how do these criminological theories play out in the real world. And because I am a big film and TV buff, this actually gave me an opportunity to be able to use what do students like as a way to explain criminological theory in real life. So one way when we're talking about subcultural theory and criminology, or when we're talking about social disorganization theory in criminology, which is all about this idea that it's not about bad places, it's about bad people, I actually screen Boys in the Hood, which I recognize the older I get is less culturally relevant to students. But what I think that they appreciate is being able to apply, okay, if I can use this film to explain this theory, what are other films that I can use to explain other theories? So we talk about The Boys, which is a TV show on Amazon that puts the whole hero narrative on its head. And I use this also in my crime and media class. We talk about the MCU, wait, MCU, Marvel Comic Universe, versus DC. So I'm able to apply, okay, these are the examples that students actually understand. How can I mold this to a way that now they can look at it from an academic lens? In reference to the readings that I use in my course, bringing this back to that zero cost text, I'm able to center different voices. So in my criminal justice 101 course, we not just focus on very traditional aspects of this is the criminal justice system, but we look at the why. So sometimes this means that I am bringing in literature reading, but looking at the ways that we can apply, look at the nuanced aspects of reading between the lines. I also make it a point to familiarize myself with my colleagues' work in my department. That way I can draw interdisciplinary or collegial connections. So in my area of research is in extremist violence, domestic terrorism. So there's a lot of overlap with mass shootings, and students really liked our mass shootings courses that we would offer with Dr. Schildekraut. So I would make it a point to reference aspects from Dr. Schildekraut's work in my class because I knew that they were taking that course at the same time. Or Dr. McCleskey, who looks at more environmental justice aspects. I try to look at, okay, what is Dr. M talking about in his course? How can I bring that into my course so that students are drawing from that particular perspective? Something that I've also found is that first-gen students tend to be less willing to participate in class because we suffer from this imposter syndrome of nothing that I can say can actually add value here. So I try to bring students into the classroom by asking them, and I did this in my crime and media course, to the detriment of my own algorithm. I asked them to please share with me all of the accounts that they follow across their various social media platforms. Did I regret that for me after the first 2 weeks of class? But because I was getting the same types of news that they were getting, I was able to provide examples that they knew in real time. And, it actually gave me an opportunity to understand where students are culturally and to roast them for their lack of taste in music.
You are bold selling that.
Um, in retrospect, so I'm teaching the crime and media class again last semester. I created a burner account. So there, and that's what I use to keep up with what students are talking about, what they're seeing, what they're discussing. And I'm also, I'm very lucky in that I think my style, because I literally just graduated last June, there are things that I'm very cognizant of that I understand students are going through, but they also are very, they find me to be very approachable, and they're not afraid to tell me about themselves, about what they're going through. And then this way we have a lot of like shared unique experiences. So for those of you who don't know me in the room, I'm from Brooklyn. And I also tend to have a lot of students who are from the Bronx. And culturally, there's a lot of like fun niche like Brooklyn versus Bronx. And I actually bring that into the classroom as a way for students to feel comfortable. And then because we have so many students who matriculate from downstate and I'm a native New Yorker, I'm able to bring those examples into the classroom as a way to create a lot of like informal conversation, but still make it academic. Yes, and then there is Queens. I actually lived in Astoria, and then Jamaica. I lived in Astoria for 2 years and Jamaica for 2 years. So there's a lot of Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx kitschy aspects. And one thing that all downstate students can agree on is we don't recognize Staten Island. And then oh, I guess I can go on with diversity. And that actually leads into diversifying engagement. So when we talk about diversifying engagement, and again, this works out very differently across the modality and the classroom setting. So the largest class that I teach is 40 students. Dr. Hannes teaches more of the larger lectures where you're seeing 100 plus students, and we have to be a little bit more mindful that different engagement styles don't work in all classroom settings. I will be teaching the larger section of Criminal Justice 101. So something that I'm thinking about now is how can I still keep up the same level of engagement that I have now in a much larger setting. Also, when you're teaching asynchronous, when you're teaching online, especially because a lot of students right now are experiencing digital or what I call the Zoom burnout, where you just don't want to be sitting in front of a computer or you lose a lot of that aspect. So one way that I try to keep engagement up is by using a lot of digital anonymous polling. So in the beginning of the semester, I'll have students, just as like brief getting to know you exercises. We'll use anonymous polling in class so that students who aren't as forthcoming to speak up in class, either because they're shy or because they have some sort of accessibility issue that keeps them from being able to speak up, they can feel grounded in the classroom. I also like to use a lot of different mixed media. So in addition to reading text, I also allow my students, I give out podcasts, we watch videos, we listen to music, we analyze lyrics, something that can really make them want to engage in the class in a way that makes them feel like it's not a traditional educational setting, but it gets them to critically analyze. And then bringing this back to digital accessibility, something that I was not aware of is when I provide a podcast, I was not providing the transcript because I did in my own accessible privilege, I was not cognizant of that. But students are very forthcoming with me and they'll say, hey, Dr. Duran, I really love that you're offering X, Y, and Z, but because of my accessibility issues, I would really appreciate a transcript or I would appreciate content that has better contrast. So because of my relationship with students, I'm able to update my materials. And actually last semester, I had a student who I would ask them if they would be comfortable with me showing them the material before it went live and letting me know if it meets the standards. And now that student will be my TA this semester as a way to help me. So when we talk about diversifying engagement, it's not just about engagement in the classroom, but also that type of personified engagement that you can have with students that creates a much better shared learning environment. Because I'm very honest with students and I tell them, I know a lot about a very specified area of criminal justice. I'm also still learning in my pedagogical aspects, and I really appreciate and use the feedback that they give me. So that's able to make it so that students want to engage in the classroom, but they also feel like everything that they're contributing is of value, even if it's not necessarily tied specifically to the curriculum.
I have so much to say about your comments on media and bringing the students in to the bringing our student, my Hood and Haudenosaunee friends say, bringing our minds together as one and using media and using music and using documentaries in order to do that. But I wonder if you would just click the button, it leads perfectly into our case studies. I'll just do it that way. So, if y'all don't know who Celinet is, I didn't know Celinet until a year ago, but I actually knew that there was a person that was Celinet about 2 years ago because she is the only professor that I have ever heard that is louder than me. And so when I was in my office, I could actually hear Dr. Duran like 3 classes away with her door closed. And and it wasn't like, oh wow, this person is annoying me. It was like, wow, there's somebody who's actually louder than I am. And I had admiration for Celinet before I had even met her. When I sat in on Celinet's class before, and I know y'all are very intelligent people, so you know this, you can tell how interesting and engaging a person is based on when your own inner monologue clicks on, when you like start, when you stop listening to them and when you start listening to your own brain. And Celinet is so loud in the classroom that she interrupts your own inner monologue. Like you can't not pay attention to her. I actually had a student write on one of my course evaluations once. I try not to pay attention in your class, and this is a direct quote, but you are so GD loud that I can't. And like that was one of those moments where I was like, I like, almost injured myself patting myself on the back because that is how loud I want to be, especially in those large lecture halls in Lanigan. And Dr. Durant said this, one of my classes I teach every semester is 100 students in one of those large lecture halls. And to me, I know I'm at the right volume when I can actually hear my voice being reverberated back to me from the metal in the back of the class. And I don't use a microphone, and I know everybody's name, even in the 100-person class. And I walk around. I do circles, in the class, counterclockwise always, in order to teach from different directions, in order to place my voice in different directions. And I use media, and I use a whole host of other I try to use all the tricks in 100-person class because there's 100 of them and one of me. So it's media, it's knowing their names, it's changing my position, it's being loud. But for the first time ever, I had a neurodivergent student come up to me after class and say, like, you're too loud. You're too loud. And it's actually he's like, I know why you're doing it, but it's actually a disservice to me. It makes it harder for me to be in the classroom. And this is one of those pieces of student feedback that I'll never stop thinking about this one. Like, I don't know the answer to this. But what I did with this student was that I provided them all the media clips. And in my 100-person class, they come into the classroom with media on, whether that's music or um, part of a documentary or um, cartoons, or I use a whole host of media. I provided them for that student before class. So they wouldn't have to come in to music, or they wouldn't have to come into art, or they wouldn't have to come in and immediately be disassociated. I'm lucky enough that it was a class that I teach both synchronously and asynchronously. So I also provided not only this student, but with the entire class with lecture videos of what I was going to go over in class, but in case they missed class, or in case they were late for class, or in case they had trouble paying attention, or in case they just wanted to go over material again, I would make those, digitally accessible lecture videos open and accessible to students all the time. Now, I would also, of course, lower the volume of my voice when I was walking in the general vicinity of this student. But I was too loud for this student. And I have a reason for being loud, and it didn't match with this student's preferred and necessary means of learning. Now, I'm happy to say that of the 5 classes that this student was enrolled in, they only passed 2 last semester, and mine was one of them, and they earned the highest grade of any course in my class. But that doesn't mean that the learning environment was pleasurable for this student. That doesn't mean that the learning environment was conducive for this student. Like I said, this is just one of those feedback and comments from students that I'm going to have to think about for the next 10 or 20 years in order to adapt, in order to evolve, in order to make my classes equitable for the entire student body. Dr. Duran, I talked with all love to your loudness, Dr. Duran. I talked a little bit about my COVID realization. What do you mean by your COVID realization?
So just as a quick aside, I do want to point out that the class that Dr. Hannes sat in on was my data analysis and statistics course. So there I had to be extra loud because I remember falling asleep when I took statistics. So it was, when we teach course electives where the idea is that students are there because they chose to be there versus core requirement courses where they have to be there. I start off every core requirement course with just because you have to be here doesn't mean you don't want to be here. And what are the different ways that we can make that happen? But so when I was talking about my COVID realization, a lot of this was related to accessibility. I feel very fortunate to be at an institution that is so cognizant of different measures of accessibility and what it means to have accessible materials and giving us opportunities through workshops like this, having this Office of Student Accessibility that works with us so individualized to help us prepare our courses. But during COVID, again, I was perpetuating a lot of my own privileges on what I assumed students had access to. So in 2020, I was working at John Jay College and I was working at Borough of Manhattan Community College, which are both Hispanic and minority serving institutions. At BMCC, the majority of students are either at or below the poverty line. So COVID happens. I am still, I'm working under the assumption where I go, okay, no big deal. I've taught these same classes online. I'm going to have a pretty easy time transitioning from in person to synchronous online instruction, no problem. I was not cognizant of the fact that students don't have computers at home. So a lot of my students would wait until they were on campus and do their assignments from a library computer. During COVID, what was happening is students would download Blackboard onto their phones. So when they would turn in assignments, it wouldn't meet the structural guidelines that I wanted. And I was penalizing students for that, but also not realizing what was going on. Or we also remember the broadband issues that we experienced during COVID, where the internet was just horrible. Students live in multi-member family homes. I had a student be very honest with me and tell me, Dr. Duran, I'm so sorry, but I live with 6 other people in the house. My siblings, we share one computer. My siblings are still in K through 12 education. So that also presented a severe barrier. So one of the things that I always say is that for me, COVID presented a silver lining in that it forced me to think about what are all of the possible barriers that my students could be facing that I don't think about either because I never had to experience them or I am now so far removed from it that I cannot connect with them in that way. So what I ended up doing was for that one particular class, I noticed that students weren't able to access the PowerPoints in the lectures in their entirety because I was just presenting PowerPoints with no audio, no visualization, nothing. So what I ended up doing was I created my own private YouTube channel where students could either access the PowerPoint standalone if that's what they preferred. I gave them audio that went along with the PowerPoint, or I actually created a video of me speaking over the lectures that they could access so they could listen to it on their phone. They could download it like they could any other podcast episode. And they were able to actually get through the material in that way. It also forced me to think about how am I giving assignments? What are the different ways that I can have students turn in assignments that also are reflective of the very many talents that they have? So for example, this upcoming semester in my crime and media course, I'm switching up the theme of the course. For the last 2 semesters, I've taught crime and media, heroes versus villains, where students, I actually taught this in kind of like a Reddit way. For those of you who are familiar with Reddit, the am I the a-hole is one of my favorite things to lose track of time in. And students also are aware of this. So what I ended up doing for that class is we use Slack. as a way to create our own in-class private Reddit simulator. And I would give them examples of either a real life crime, a fictionalized crime, but I would take away any identifying factors. And then I would ask them to determine who is the hero, who is the villain here. This was actually an idea that I got from my terrorism course, where we looked at the Nicaragua, the Iran-Contra affair, and I didn't tell them anything. I just gave them the characteristics, and they were like, "Oh my God, this is so horrible. Why would you do this?" And then when I presented, well, actually, the big bad here was Ronald Reagan. So it gave us an opportunity to look at what happens when we take the identifiers out of a situation and only evaluate the content of what's going on. So for the next semester, I'm teaching crime in the media, scam fraud. So we're looking at fakes, phonies, and frauds as a way to contextualize white collar crime for students, and kind of like an opportunity for us to get away from the more heavy emotional aspects of the criminal justice curriculum that I teach by looking at scammers of the 21st century, because students tend to really appreciate that. And instead of turning in a traditional paper, I'm working with Sarah O'Shea in the library to help students come up with their own podcast episode as a way to, so for their midterm project, they will have to turn in a script as what they intend to do. So actually doing the research. And then for the second half of the semester, they'll be working on actually producing this, because I know that there are students who love to talk, but only if they're in front of a camera or in front of a microphone. So I want to give them that opportunity, but also I want them to be able to leave here and say, oh, I have experience with this multimedia messaging. I have experience with doing research on a particular aspect and then presenting that in a way that is digestible for mass media or public consumption. So I'm really looking forward to that. And it also takes students away from that traditional writing aspect and letting them know, yes, we are still about academic rigor, but that doesn't mean that you can't look at all of the different ways that you can apply yourself and learning about that material. So COVID really did help me to understand what are the different ways that I can, one, deliver my content, and two, make my assessments more relatable to students in a way that's actually fun for them, which I know that I have a love-hate relationship with the term fun learning, because it kind of connotes this idea that as educators, we also have to be entertainers. But I also want students to actually want to engage in the material in a way that is that's personalized to them. And I'm actually really looking forward. It gives me an opportunity to see how students are thinking, how they evaluate these aspects, and what that looks like, the differences in between what their written work looks like versus what their more creative work looks like. Oh, and here's my friend to say hello.
Daddy,
You want to say hi?
no.
No, hi. Dr. Duran, since we can talk a lot and since we prepared too much, I wonder what you think about moving on to icebreakers
Yes.
and then still trying to leave a few minutes for a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because we could talk about we prepared, so we prepared too much.
We overly prepared.
Avery, I'm going to talk about icebreakers, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Bye,
So
Avery.
icebreakers are tough, and I don't do them because I haven't figured out a good way to do them in all of my classes. But I just want to share with you what I know is my most successful. What I know is my most successful icebreaker, and Dr. Duran is going to share what is her most successful icebreaker. And this is really the only one that I do. I don't do two truths and a lie. I don't do any of that kind of um, what I would consider to be just like surface level icebreakers. And so this is for my NAS 240 American Indian Religion and Philosophy course. And in a previous life, I taught courses in religion and philosophy. I taught courses specifically in ethics and values. And that's where this icebreaker comes from. I ask students to introduce themselves, the traditional introduction, your name, your hometown, your year and major in school. And then I ask them, what is the best thing that they have ever done? And the follow-up question to that is, and how do you know? And so in a group of 15 or 20 students, I will be able to meander through the bulk of the high points, let's say, or the key points of Western philosophy. Kant and the categorical imperative, Jeremy Bentham in qualitative utilitarianism. A quote from Jeremy Bentham got me out of jury duty once, by the way. So it's not a wash to know Western philosophy. Consequentialism, altruism in Hobbes, egoism in Ayn Rand is the example I'll use for egoism, existentialism in Kierkegaard, ethics of the other. Emmanuel Levinas is one of my preferred Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. And so students will say, this is the best thing I've ever done, and this is how I know it was good. But then I will say I will play a short video clip for them from YouTube, and it's entitled, "What is the worst thing you have ever done?" And it's about 100 people honestly saying what the worst thing they've ever done is. And it's about 3 minutes long, and it's jarring, especially for students to hear on day one. And then they get the question. They honestly get the question. I ask the group, what is the worst thing you have ever done? And some of the responses that I have gotten back, I will remember for the rest of my life. There was a girl she was in 4th grade, and her mother was dying of cancer. And she was jawing back and forth with another girl at the lunch table. They were insulting each other. And the girl said to her, "Yeah, well, at least my mother isn't dying of cancer." And the student in my class grabbed this other, 10-year-old girl by both sides of her head and started smashing her head into the lunch table. And she said, "I only came to when they had gotten me off of her, and I was out in the hallway, and I had a clump of her hair in my left hand and a clump of her hair in my right hand." Another student whose stepfather was abusive to her, and she knew he had bad knees, pushed her stepfather down the stairs, and he broke both of his knees. I'll remember these responses for the rest of my life. Again, but the idea behind it is that once one person shares, another hand goes up. Once that second hand goes up, 3 more hands go up. Once 3 hands go up, suddenly all 12 or 15 people who didn't know each other prior to that day are now openly sharing not only the best thing that they've ever done, I'll put it on, Avery, but also the worst thing that they've ever done. This is a powerful moment for people who don't know each other to begin to cultivate trust inside the classroom. And so, like I said, I don't know many icebreakers that work, but this over the years has been my most successful one because students openly begin to trust each other and create that environment day one. Not from 2 truths and a lie, but what is the best thing you've ever done? And then what is the worst thing you've ever done? And then we get to talk about over the entire semester about why none of them said from the land. And that's the answer that they get in NAS 240. Dr. Duran, what about your most successful icebreaker?
Sorry, didn't realize I was muted. In my intro course, I like to start off and I do something, it's kind of similar, where I ask them, pretend like assume this is the purge. What crime would you commit and why? And I do present specific caveats. You can't name any specific person in the room. You can't identify, no murder, and you can't target any sitting politician. Had to put that in as of a few years ago because for obvious reasons, based on the political landscape of our society. And I did not want to get brought up on charges of conspiracy to treason. So I asked him, if you could commit any crime, what would it be? And I like this exercise because it helps us get into the mindset of, one, what students consider is a crime, looking at the different aspects of the sociocultural evolution of crime. So a lot of the responses that I've gotten is students will say, oh, I'd rob Jeff Bezos, I'd steal from Elon Musk, I'd take from the super rich, I'd commit, like one student said that he would commit securities fraud and then actually went into how he would do it. And I'm like, I'm not even going to ask what it is that your parents do because I don't want to get into that. But in there, so for starters, it helps us understand. So when I first started doing this exercise back in 2014, students would say, oh, I would smoke a lot of weed because, and that was still considered pretty criminal, still pretty deviant. Now students are saying like a lot of it would be stealing money, getting money, robbing a bank. So that also looks into how what they're thinking about is reflective of maybe certain aspects that they are feeling in their personal lives. It's more reflective of what's going on, probably the economy. So it gets us into a conversation on, so these are crimes that you are perfectly okay with that aren't, they're criminal, but not necessarily deviant. So they get us into talking about the difference between criminality and deviance. Then I ask them, okay, what keeps you from committing crime today? What stops you from going into Pathfinder and robbing the bank? And, you know, a lot of students will say, well, I'm afraid to go to jail. So it talks, so we are able to have conversations on formal social control. But then I have a lot of students, usually students who look like me, who will say, I'm afraid of disappointing my parents, or I'm afraid of my mom. That is my answer. I tell students I'm very honest. I go, honestly, I am more afraid of my mother than I am of any criminal justice agency. That is what has kept me from committing crime, from staying on the straight and narrow. And it gets us to discussing aspects on informal social control. We talk about the family being the primary institution of socialization. Then it gets us into a conversation. And I set it up this way because students who come into a 101 are usually freshman, sophomore, who have a very limited worldview of what actually goes on around them. And the only aspects that they know for the most part of crime control is informal control from students, from parents. Then we look at the different ways that our guidelines change once with our peers, looking at educational systems, educational institutions as institutions of control. So we get to talking about that. And then that leads us into our very first reading of the semester, which is the chapter from Kristen Henning on how we criminalize wardrobe. So it's a way that kind of sets up the class on this is who we are, this is how we think, and then this is how I am going to be applying your thinking to what we discuss in class. And then just as a follow-up, because I know we're over time here, I do this game called Plead the Fifth. And they can ask me whatever they want. Obviously, I tell them, you know, please keep in mind the professional boundaries of I am your professor, you are my student. So keep that in mind when you ask. And I use anonymous polling. They can ask me whatever it is that they like. I can only plead the fifth once. So I mean, when I first started doing this, I was much younger. And I was actually the youngest person in the room because I taught a lot of non-traditional students. They would ask me my age, which I'm not afraid to disclose. They'd ask me, oh, you know, what's the best class to take here? Or really what they'll ask me is, how did I end up where I am? So I tell them, you know, I'm from the inner city. I'm from East New York, Brooklyn. I'm an immigrant. My parents have no formal education. My father came to this country with the equivalent of a fourth grade education. I grew up one of seven. So that is a very, it's a much different journey from where I started to where I am. And I appreciate the students ask me that because then it allows me to discuss with them why I take my work so personally, why I chose the path that I'm in, and why I genuinely enjoy being in the classroom. And that sets up that aspect of how we establish trust within the room. I think this whole time that I played this game, in almost 10 years, I've pled the fifth twice. And one of them was because at the time they asked a question about like a personal relationship that I was actually going through a really difficult time with, and I didn't want to discuss that. And then another time, a student asked me if I had ever been involved in any criminal nefarious activity. And at that time, I was not comfortable disclosing. Like, it wasn't anything terrible. It was just a bad speeding ticket that ended up, it ended up not getting paid because I forgot. and then the not paid ticket turned into a bench warrant. But that's an example that I'm actually pretty comfortable discussing with students now, because it gets us into that conversation on how precarious the criminal justice system is, where, hey, I've had a warrant out for my arrest, but it was for something pretty innocuous, not paying a speeding ticket. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a career criminal. And that's what I have.
No, it just means you are very, very bold for having activities like this, and for only allowing yourself one opportunity to plead the fifth
I'll
per
say that for the
icebreaker.
most part, they're pretty respectful. And they don't ask anything that's I would consider to be wild or outlandish. And I now, this works well in my criminal justice 101 course, where I don't know any of those students for the most part. But in my other courses, I tend to have a lot of repeat students. So I have to change up my intro. So in my race and criminal justice class, what I do is I play a game called Is This Racist? Where we talk about very innocuous sayings that everyone says all the time, and then we talk about their origin. So for example, the idiom, no comments from the peanut gallery, I'll ask them, is this racist? And then we'll get into, well, how did this actually start? Looking at, oh, that's a barrel of laughs. Or the saying that a lot of us growing up heard, you better come home before the streetlights cut on. So we get into talking about, oh, what are sunset laws? Where does this actually come from? So I try to tailor my introductory aspect to whatever it is that we're doing in that particular class.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's where the most successful icebreakers come from.
Yeah.
When you can when you can weaponize a lesson out of it on day one.
Exactly, yeah.
At the same time, you're cultivating trust.
Yeah, so it's I kind of fake them into learning without realizing that they're learning.
Yep. John, I know we're far over time, but y'all have been sitting here. Does anybody have any questions? Because Celinet and I obviously prepared too much.
I just really appreciate the way that you've presented and presenting yourselves and your work is makes us much more relatable than sort of just going through the principles of equity and the general strategies. So I just want to thank you guys for being really sharing in this presentation. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would second that. It's been really stimulating. A lot of good ideas. I especially for me, because I come from a generation where we were taught to be a little bit more distant from students, right? And so over the years, I've learned to become more myself, and that's really helped in my teaching as well. But this is really instructive. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to raise a question about zero cost and low cost courses. I don't know if I teach in the film studies program. And so we created the program here to be accessible and equitable for film studies, where it's one of the areas that has been the least accessible and equitable because of the associated costs with it. And we still have to do a lot of work that's sort of structural to make it more accessible. And I would just encourage people to think about things like we've worked with the bookstore, so students who want to purchase cameras are able to use their loans. Still, we don't want them to use loans, and we get reduced packages through different companies, and we do a lot of thinking about what we can do to reduce costs that are real barriers. Of course, we also have equipment that students can borrow, things like that. But it's a really big challenge. And I think that the more we can think institutionally rather than also just individually about issues of access, where there are, for example, there's a lot of literature that we don't subscribe to at the library, and that's partially cost related. And I just think having more institutional conversations about how to have that access would be really, really valuable. And for colleagues who are like, well, I just scan things and I put them on the computer. That's accessible. Having them better understand why we would want to expend resources for these kinds of things.
Yeah, that's a really great point that you bring up. And, you know, it also goes into this aspect of not every discipline has the ability to be to offer as many cost-effective measures. And I know that in the creative space, which is where students tend to thrive the most, tends to be the least accessible just based on price point, cost, especially when we're working with a student population that's also working and putting themselves through college. And I also like that you brought up our own accessibility through our e-resources. So I have been scamming John Jay and telling them, because I am still listed as an adjunct for both the sociology department and the law and police science department, and I never officially told them that I'm not coming back. So I still have my John Jay credentials, and I have access to a lot of the specialized criminology, criminal justice, sociology journals that we do not have here on campus. But that's, you know, specific to my situation and my ability to hustle academia. But the other thing too is that, so that comes with a grain of salt, because in one way, I'm working to make these aspects accessible for students, but by providing them the reading, I'm also simultaneously depriving the author of that download, that viewer of, oh, your article has been viewed or downloaded X many times, which is something that I did not become aware of until I started publishing. And I realized how important that is to be able. So in graduate school, I used to get really annoyed because they would give us the citation, and then we were responsible for getting the article ourselves. And I used to get so annoyed because I was just like, well, I don't understand why you can't just put it on Blackboard. Like, I'm already here. And then I realized that it's because they wanted that viewer or download credit to go to the author. So it's, you know, a grain of salt. But it's one of those things where I agree much larger conversations need to be had, because it goes so much more beyond I'm just providing this article for you, or how do I make this accessible? Like, how do I make this equitable for all parties involved, not just one specific party?
And anytime you guys want to talk about using media in your classrooms, I would love it, because I love hearing how you guys are using films and documentaries and stuff, since that's what we do all the time. It's just exciting for me. So give me
Oh,
an
thank
email.
you. Thank you. Yeah. So I've been venturing more off into the media space just because I see that's, especially with TikTok, like students just love recording themselves. So, and I also do encourage students to reuse work. So for example, in my classes, if they're working on a paper for me, I let them choose their own topics, and I tell them I am okay if, let's say, your literature review is also the same literature review or parts of it from another class, because that's just collaborative. However, you need to clear that with your other professor, because just because it's okay in my classroom doesn't mean it's okay in another classroom. And I don't want them to get negatively penalized because I'm encouraging them to think about these cross-sectional connections that they can make. But I do love the opportunity of, like, not just across classes, but across disciplines, and showing them, because this is a liberal arts college. So the whole point is that everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. So what are the different ways that we can collaborate with different departments, different schools, so that students can see, oh, I'm getting the most bang for my buck because I get to use everything here.
Excellent. Hey, I hate to interrupt, but we're actually a couple minutes over
Oh,
into
sorry.
another session that should have started a couple minutes ago. So, you know, is there any kind of last, you know, any contact information people can reach out to you for more conversation?
If you just walk into Mahar, just look for the loudest, listen for the loudest professors in Mahar, and you'll end up with either me or Dr. Duran.
Yes,
I love
and
it.
I have the loudest office in Bahar right next to the elevator. You'll see what I mean by loud when you see it.
Well, thank you both so much. And if they are willing to share the slides, that's something, if you send it to me as well, I can post that along with the recording of the video. All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.